Louis chooses quite rightly to let his performance stand in for him. But I'm here. I haven't seen this performance before, but I'm willing to try to respond to comments you have or questions you have. I think you should speak with a microphone. It's easier for everyone, especially behind you, to hear.
Yes, thank you for clarifying these pictures so wonderfully to us. It was very interesting. But I was also curious, what was your motivation to change your voice?
Well, since Louis is not here, we have to try to answer this ourselves. You know, like when we're confronted with another artwork that isn't given a commentary. So why don't you try yourself starting to answer that?
Well,
what do you think the motivation might be?
Well, the theme of the conference, of course.
Sorry?
The theme of the conference is, of course, the first reason to think of maybe doing something with the voice or change my voice. I noticed that in the beginning it was really annoying to me. And I thought, oh my gosh, can this stop, please? And then after a while, I didn't notice anymore. I was completely used to it, and also because I was so intrigued by the content. So that was an interesting aspect, I think, the getting used to it of a completely artificial sound so quickly.
Anyone else?
I'll try to give an answer to that. For me, at least, it was very helpful to understand the role of the performer, the artist, who is not himself as a person, because, of course, if you are on stage, you can think very quickly that he is talking from his own position. But with this artificial voice, I found it quite easy to imagine a third person to really make up an own character. So I was looking through him and I saw another person, a created person.
Yeah. The artist was reading this text.
It was the artist, okay.
Yeah.
So who was not there then? Oh, he's not there, okay.
I mean, it's a very interesting question also in terms of what we're going to do now, because actually to put a performance there, but to not accept this position of reflecting upon your work is exactly the obverse of what we're going to do now, which is actually talk about someone's work with the artist, with Imogen, and we'll enter that. But just to try to sum that up, I think it could be interpreted at least in two different ways. On one hand, using this voice, trying to get to a child's voice. It's not a child's voice, but of course it goes towards the child's voice. And thereby, because it's failure to do that, subverting this idea of the cuteness that Louis was talking about in the beginning. So that is quite a intentionally subversive gesture to try to counter that, because it's not fixing it, and then it's also this cuteness. It's also counterposing these documentary photos of kids, which seem like they're from another realm than the Gorski or that Anne Geddes picture. I'm assuming that it's unget, is this horrible picture postcard of the rabbit bunny, or it's someone, she invented this genre, so either it's her or it's someone who's using the same genre. On the other hand, we have to remind ourselves, and you actually, Louis, talked about this as well, that it's the gaze of the photographer who's complicit with this and who's actually creating it. And this is quite apparent, especially with the last one, which is also a snapshot, just like the one in Düsseldorf. It's also a snapshot, but it's a snapshot that does much more in framing, making a certain scene, and rather than another scene. So this shot, the last picture we saw, wouldn't have been possible if it had been done a second later, whereas the one with the cartwheel would have been possible with doing, so I think the first documentarist you showed is much more, or that Louis showed, is much more interested in actually being a medium, channeling the kids, than the second one who's rechanneling or projecting herself as an artist onto that children's scene. That's how I would analyze it, to be honest. And then there's another interpretation of this, assuming this weird voice, which is that Louis wants to do something that artists often want to do, which is control everything and assume more than just his own voice. This kind of magnum, trying to do more than one, because there were at least two voices that we could hear. So he was speaking as himself, and you're right, he was there, but he's also claiming more space than that, claiming also the child's position and claiming also the subversive position. So that is maybe a more ambivalent thing, and we'd have to really enter into a conversation about that with him. But that's not what's happening now, because we're entering into another conversation. Hello, Imogen.
Maybe the way I can splice into Lewis's performance, when he was speaking, actually quoting Laurie Anderson, and then I had the impression that I was really hearing Laurie Anderson, and I'm not sure how much that was my own projection, because she has such a particular way of speaking. So, but I had the impression that technically, actually, the voice had not changed at all, and so this was a moment in which I was kind of creating Laurie Anderson through Lewis, and he became a kind of channeler, or he became an embodiment for that moment, just through intonation and maybe a familiar script.
Yes, that's true.
So I was thinking that having covered or touched on so many different aspects of the relation between voice and body, or the detachment of the voice from the body, and then our own desires and projections to kind of stitch them back together again throughout the day, that maybe rather than reflecting kind of explicitly on that, I could run through several clips of works that span actually the first clip is from 1995, so 20 years nearly. That's a long time, and maybe give you some practical information where it's useful, but perhaps really invite you, if you see reflections or echoes or resonances in connection with other moments or ideas that we've encountered today, maybe in very different languages, then it would be very interesting to hear from you. So perhaps we'll start by looking at a piece from 95. When I'd just started working with the voice really as a sort of central material, having worked mainly with sculptural installation, and always including some less stable media like a Super 8 film or a photograph, but also very kind of assertive, large structural objects, physical objects in spaces. And then I started working with the voice and language. And this is a piece that I made with my father. It was called Elocution. This is just a 1-minute clip. We need some more volume. Can you put the volume up, please?
Eating her curds and whey. Along came a spider and sat down beside her.
And then quickly following that, a year later.
And we're just showing clips of works. That's maybe important to say.
Yes.
And also because it's important for two reasons. First of all, so you know that it's just a clip of a work. But secondly, because Imogen being working with sound is also someone who's also very meticulous about the sound. And I'm very grateful that you so generously allow us to watch work like this, which is not in proper sound condition, because you have, as we progress in the work, it's dependent on very complex sound systems.
But for today, it seems to make sense that we look at, these are just things taken out of installations, and they're quite often very spatial, different elements which are arranged in a certain way with particular kind of acoustics and relation between moving image and sound and physical material. But we won't go into that at all, really just looking at some different clips which I think even in themselves can already touch on some of the key ideas that I was working with in those pieces and can still be conveyed, I think, without, of course, in a different way. But this piece called 2 from 1996, I'm just showing 2 clips because it really exists in 2 modes, which happen with over 26 minutes, moving between something which is almost like a still image and then moments when my father is speaking or when I'm operating a typewriter. And so a very strong sort of polarization between the visual, the retinal image, the composed, framed image, and then entering into the voice of the subject. So this is just the first. This was shown on 2 screens, separate screens.
So I thought, well, but there was one slightly ajar. And I went in, and we seemed to be in a sort of high-class bordello with divans and roulette and bagatelles, whatever, games and sumptuous sofas and drinks cabinets and everything. And there he was with his trousers down already. Well, that was the killer. And he drove me back. And I went to bed and I stood by my window. I opened the French windows and I looked out and I looked down and I could see there was this gully inviting me to die, just to fall, not even to jump, just to fall, just to let go. And I thought, no, I can't. I can't do that.
So those 2 pieces were made within a year of each other.
Anyway, the phone went again at about 1 o'clock in the morning and I was in bed. I was actually sort of not asleep, of course. I was desperate. But the phone rang. And the voice said, oh, I'm Carlo's friend. I'm waiting for you in the bar downstairs. I said, what on earth for? It's 1 o'clock in the morning. Well, he said, you know why. And again I thought, well, I don't have to go down. But it did. For the repeat performance.
He's still interrupting me 20 years later. I thought I could put those together and just say a few things. I mean, the first piece, we were talking earlier a lot about the difference between voiceover and dubbing. And I don't think we touched on lip sync, but the first piece is more related to lip sync, where there is a real attempt to try to inhabit the words that are being spoken by somebody else. So I was repeating or trying to synchronize my mouth to my father's words. And of course, what he was speaking was very familiar children's rhymes that everybody, all English children will know the rhymes that he was speaking. And this was a piece of about 15 minutes. But nothing was rehearsed. I mean, this was entirely improvised within certain rules in a certain general direction. And so thinking very much about the transmission of a voice from the father to the child, from the authority to the one who's sort of somehow being inducted into language, and how that process of working with rhymes, which are in a sense a kind of mnemonic device, they're easy to remember, but they also help you to remember certain narratives and images which become very much sort of part of your formation as a young child. So kind of acting out this process of receiving words and speaking the voice of somebody else, particularly in this case speaking the voice of my father. And in both these pieces, looking at aspects of how power relations between individuals can be played out and manifested through voice and language. But at that time, working very much on a personal level, working through my family members, and maybe something else to say about how that space between two bodies and two voices is sort of almost in a topological way, how that's set out. So in the first piece, there's a kind of perhaps there's some role for the viewer in playing for themselves in where they feel that voice is located. And there is a moment where you can see I'm prompting him, so this power play kind of turns around. He's forgotten what he's supposed to say. I clearly have already totally internalized this rhyme, and I'm prompting him. So there's a game around who is the author of the words and who is the receiver of the words. But it's kind of playful. And the second piece, that kind of the way in which listening can be, in a certain sense, one can, there's a sort of, there's a violence in being subjected to having to listen to another, and the sense of the question of where is the self in that moment of being fully absorbed in somebody else's voice was acted out in a much more violent way, and so we were in two separate physical spaces, which are clearly filmed at the same moment, and here this collapsing of the space between us when I would assert my own language. It wasn't a vocal language, it was a mechanical language. This was a kind of play that I was
Maybe just also for those who've been in the previous session, I now realize that the first work actually has a connection to the Dakich, the receiving of the words in an interesting way. And I was also thinking as you were playing it, because of the clip that I showed in the beginning, hoping that it would somehow feed into Louis' performance, and they're rhyming. And I was just thinking, is rhyme really the most strong social control in a certain way, because these are handed down and they don't change, and there's gender roles are played through these rhymes, are played out and learned through these rhymes, also through the games that they're playing? Or is it a kind of a neutral background, because it's a kind of a common language that everyone uses, and that's somehow not personal? It's depersonalized.
It's a very it's both. And this relation between if you internalize something, and this came up in relation to Lena's speech earlier, that when she speaks those words, they do become her own. And in a sense, she gives them her own meaning, and anyone listening senses that the meaning has become her own. And the tension in that relation between internalizing the speech of another, or the language of another, or the script of another, but the way in which it also becomes, I think this is what we're always kind of negotiating, and so it's not conclusive, and it's not resolved. It's an ongoing live kind of, in some cases it can be a battle, as it was in these pieces, but when it's not a battle, it's an ongoing question, isn't it?
And also maybe we're not going completely chronologically, but we have 3 sections in the talk, and they're going vaguely chronologically, and I named them, the 3 sections. These are my terms, and the first one is what is it?
Psychology.
Psychology. And then the second one is therapy, and the third one is technology. So I thought that, you know, starting from an artist who's working with her family, working about this, you know, trying to get out of from under your father and yours, that was very funny that you said, he's still interrupting me, whereas in the film, you're actually interrupting him. So, you know, you can't get out of from under your father because you're still going back to the same roles even 20 years later after you've done that work. And then, but then you take the same kind of issues and you will see that. And then you put them onto other questions.
And also through people who have a very different relation. I mean, to others with whom perhaps I almost invariably have no relation at all, or particularly others with whom I find it very difficult to understand how I can share common language or share common terms. So the making of the work becomes a process performative in that sense, that I try to work it out and find some kind of terms that can mutually make sense. So there's always being both, this is what the work is about, but it's also what the work has to do in order to happen at all.
And just to make one last connection, that's also something that Wendeline's practice, Imogen shares with Wendeline's practice, just as an aside. But,
for those who saw the Wendeline's film yesterday. But actually, jumping forward to 2009, this is a sound piece which is called Get Here.
Get Here.
And it's surround sound. I mean, it's 10.2 surround sound, so we're listening to it in stereo, so a very, very flattened out version of a very three-dimensional sound space. It's about 4 minutes long. And I just need to maybe say that it's working with a very characteristic phrase, local phrase in Liverpool, which is the city that I'm living in now. So it's a phrase, has a very particular sense of place, and the phrase is, get here. So instead of saying, come here in Liverpool, they'll say, get here now. And they don't say it anywhere else in Britain. So it becomes part of Liverpool. It's a phrase that Liverpudlians identify with. And like any accent, it evokes very particular characteristics and stereotypes, of course, related to the idea of what kind of a person the speaker of this accent will be. And a speaker of a Scouse accent will probably, the cliches are all related to the relationship between Liverpool and Ireland, so they're related to orality and humour and song, but also criminality and poverty. I mean, you can list, like any accent, there are all sorts of attributes that are attached to it. So this piece is using just that one phrase and being spoken by about 30 different women, because it's generally women who say the phrase, because they're generally talking to their kids and getting them to come here. And here, of course, means near the woman's body, near the mother's body. Come here. But it's been spoken by people who have very different relationship with that accent, because they have maybe very recently arrived Somali immigrants, or they've been living for many generations in the city, or they're young actresses who are learning to produce like a perfect, authentic Scouse accent.
And before you start, if the photographer in Louis Jacobs' Düsseldorf photo had made a film, the woman who's dragging the child behind her might have said the next image, an instance, get here.
In now. Get here.
Get here.
Oh, get here.
Get here.
Get here.
Get here. Get here. I'm telling you. All right. I'm telling you now. Get here. Get here.
Well, like if
now.
you were Christopher.
Yeah.
Get here now.
I'm warning you.
Get here.
Get
James.
yourself here.
Get here.
Get here. Get here, you. Get here. Come here. And then it'll be, get yourself over here now. Oh, get here. Come on. Oh, get here. You won't go to the bats and he won't go to the match, so get over here now. I'm going over ours.
What do you want? Get here. Get here.
Now, come on. Oh, get here, love. Come on. Oh.
Get here.
Get here, you. Get yourself here. Get here, you.
Get here.
Come on, get here.
Get here.
Get here.
Get here. Get here now. Get here now.
Now.
Oh. Just get here now. Get here. Yeah, get here. You get here. No, don't do that. Get here.
Get here.
Get here now. Get here, please.
Get here.
Be quick. Come on, get here.
What do you want? Get here.
Get here.
Come here. Get here. Get here. What do you want?
Yeah. Get here now.
Come here. Now.
Get here now.
Come here now. Talking to you. Come
Get here now, Connie.
Get here.
Connie.
Now. You
Get here now.
Get here, you too. Oh.
You over there on your own. Come on. Let's go.
Get here.
Hey, you. Come here, darling. Come on, quickly. Come on. Quickly. Come on.
Listen. Now listen.
Listen to you. Quickly. Get here. I told you to get here now.
Yeah.
Hey, as you said it. Get here now.
Get here, I'm going home.
Here, now. Come on. How many times? Get here.
Get here now.
Quick, come on, get here.
Get here.
What are you doing? Get here.
Get.
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 Here.
Get.
Here. Get. Here.
Get.
Get here. Here. Get here. Get.
I'm losing my patience.
Get
over here. Now.
Okay, come on.
Shift. Move.
You.
Get here.
Get here. Let's
Get
go.
here.
Ready? Come on.
Get. Oh,
Come on. Get here. Yeah.
Oh, get here now. Come on. Get. Here. Here. Get inside. I don't wanna. Come here and come inside. Come here. Get here. You get here. Get here. You get here. Get here. Get here. Get here. No, get inside.
Come on, get here.
Get here.
Oh.
Get here. Come on. Come over. Here. Get in. Get here. Get here. Now you're all right. Come on. Get here. Get in. Yeah. Get in here.
Let's fucking get here right now. All right.
Get here.
Come on.
Over here now.
Jesus Christ, get here now.
Get here now.
Quick. Move. Get here now. Talking to you, lad. Yeah. You. Yeah. You with the blue ass on. I mean now. Quick. Move. Get over. Get here.
So there's several years between those two works, and I think one of the main things that has changed is that the space, the kind of space that the voice occupies, from being these very distinct, discrete spaces which are related to very easily definable and sort of designated subject positions of the father and the child, or the man and the woman, have become completely merged or confused, fused with each other into a cloud of voices, a cloud of positions, and the idea of here is totally multiple. You won't get the here because it's in stereo, but you can imagine that these voices are coming from many different positions in physical space, but also figuratively. And equally, the idea of where the self is located is constantly moving around. So here is wherever I happen to be, but where I am is all the time moving. So I think then also the sense of there being a certain sound, a certain shape of pronunciation, a certain accent which is tied to a certain place, and tied to that again is a certain set of characteristics. Every utterance is slightly different. So this idea of repetition, when repetition is happening, then it's always also producing these slight differences and slight variations in which it starts to mean any number of different things. This single phrase. This actually is something which came out of it, which came later, thinking about the relation between accent and geographical space and subjecthood, and the idea of a kind of landscape of the voice as a space, creating a kind of a landscape. And these waterfall plots are just visualizations coming from a computer program which renders them in this very physical, topographical way. There's a series of prints called Topography of a Voice.
I would be just interested, why do they have they developed this kind of computer program? What's its function?
It's used in voice analysis, and usually those visualizations have 2 axes and 1 or 3 axes. One is about the speed of the utterance, one is about the decibels, one is about the hertz. So you can describe the voice in a technical way, and it's a measuring device, but a very visual measuring device. And there are many different ways of showing sound, but this was a particularly topographical one, which gives the sound a very physical shape. And for me, it becomes like a fantastical landscape. It's like those sort of 19th century copper plate etchings where you have fantastical mountains described through many, many fine kind of concentric curved lines. And it sort of changes this immaterial, intangible vocal substance into this, into a landscape, into physical space.
But you could also say that, as with a landscape and the mapping of landscape, which has, of course, a certain reason. I mean, maps are made again for colonial reason mostly. So the era of the map making is very much connected to that. And there's someone who said that actually the idea of the blind spot in a map has only been developed at the time when almost everything is mapped. Yeah, so you could probably, and that will maybe we will come back to that. We don't have to discuss it now, but in the later work, you could probably connect it also, make the same kind of supposition. So it's not just a function; it's a function with a purpose that someone would invent a kind of program for mapping a voice.
But also that the blind spot, or where the possibility to describe or record the material such as a voice, or material or to interpret or to translate from sound, from a voice into a graphic description, for example, into graphic rendition, or into international phonetic alphabet, which is up at the top. To translate from one set of terms to another. Perhaps it's not always possible to see the limits of that translation within each set of terms, but when you bump them up against each other and sort of start to see what is missing within any one of those forms of translation or forms of transcription. I mean, here there are just 4. There's this waterfall plot. There's IPA. There are comments from speakers of Scouse, people who speak with a Scouse accent, and then there's a kind of running narrative through several pages in the paragraphs in the middle of the print, which is the description of a voice coach and dialect specialist. He's describing how that accent is produced in very physiological terms, but also he's always injecting all sorts of assumptions and kind of stereotypes actually through the way he describes. Just on one hand, it's supposed to be a very technical description, and it is very precise. But on the other hand, it's always been coloured by his. One of his examples was about the way that every accent has a certain sound, which you can use as an actor or actress. You can use that as a sort of shoehorn sound to get you into the accent, because it's always difficult to kind of shift from your own into the other. So there'll be a certain word or a certain phrase that you can use to kind of get you in. So the word for Scouse is fochen. Like fucking, fochen. And his example was, I was coming into town the other day in the fucking busy stock mix. I didn't have my fucking tax plate. So it was like, okay.
We didn't understand that. You have to translate that.
What he was talking about was being stopped by the police because his tax disc was expired. But, so every example he gave was in some way the character which would be kind of, you'd imagine from this example would be somebody who is kind of like, another one is like, it's like being poked in the chest. So the way that the T's are pronounced in a very frontal way at the front of the palate is like being poked in the chest. So this kind of slightly violent or slightly criminal sort of stereotypes are being evoked at every turn. But so this is a kind of bringing together different forms of translation, if you like, or different forms of transcription, from sound, from voice, and each form of mapping or attempting to describe, attempting to notate something in other terms. It's sort of, I suppose it's in the gaps between them, those kind of failings start to become apparent, or might start to become apparent. this is going back to 2000, and it's video, single screen work, an excerpt from a 10-minute piece. This is observing, it came out of spending several months observing the treatment of an actor, actually, who had voice strain problems, and he was being treated by an osteopath. He's developed he's developed a unique method for treating voice strain, usually in singers, but which involves direct manipulation of the larynx and the whole sort of, actually a lot of the body, but it's focusing mainly on the larynx. And so I had the chance to sit over several months and watch what was happening between them, but also to become aware of my own role and my own projections on this scene, and try to find a way to record and to show what was happening, but also to show the way that I was framing what was happening and the way that I was interpreting the relationship between the two of them. And that came through, perhaps as you'll see, through the framing of the shots and the ways in which all the kind of associations that one has in watching a very concentrated process between two individuals, being a witness to that, being an observer, not directly taking part, but somehow realizing that actually you're also shaping what's happening between them.
One. Yes. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9.
I think it brings back to mind the first piece in elocution. There was some play at the idea of, in lip syncing, in attempting to somehow embody the voice of another, there's also this kind of ventriloquial idea of the ventriloquial voice, or the act of projecting your voice into another person, and that this can, on the one hand, be a certain violence in terms of what you impose on another, but it can also be a certain form of escape from having, as we were talking earlier about the possibility to have more than one voice, and the possibility by speaking in different voices one can employ different languages and perhaps kind of animate different aspects of one's self, different dimensions of oneself. And that idea of the ventriloquial, which I worked with explicitly with, literally with a ventriloquist in Brussels in 1998. But it's still, I think, running through all of my work, and even with Alex, I was thinking a lot about this relation of, on the one hand, his inanimate, immobile, totally embodied self, from which we hear very little apart from a little bit of counting. Extraordinary sort of passive body, given the penetrating treatment that he's undergoing, and it's quite painful, that treatment as well. And then the attention and the action of the doctor, who's almost like kneading his voice into his body, or trying to, or pulling his voice out of his body. I should just explain that Alex's problem was that his larynx was contracted to the maximum that is possible for your larynx, and that's the position of a primal scream, the kind of scream that you make when you're not passing through any of the language cortex at all. It's the most basic emission of a fear or for flight. So he could speak quite comfortably, but he couldn't raise his voice. If he tried to raise his voice, it was painful, and he discovered that on stage, and he'd started having this treatment, and I started observing the treatment after he'd been working with Jacob for about 2 years, and nothing much had happened in that time. Nothing much had shifted in his experience, but every week he would go to Jacob, and Jacob would manipulate his larynx, pushing it into the position that it should be when it's relaxed, to try to trigger the muscle memory to remember how it should. It had sort of become so out of practice of actually relaxing back into its correct position. So there was a lot going on for me in terms of the relation between the two of them, also in terms of the image, whereas in the work with my father too, the kind of the status or the role of the visual image. Sometimes when he's silent, he's like a painting, and he's set up like a painting, and one can observe him and scrutinize him in that way, and become very aware of his nakedness and his exposure to our eyes, and the age of his body and so on. He's quite vulnerable. But when he starts to speak, suddenly this whole subjectivity and interiority opens up, and a whole story opens up. And I was interested in that switching between his vulnerability and then the authority or the seduction, really, of his voice, and his great ease at speaking, and how you get drawn into a story which actually, but like a cloak or camouflage or something, it actually clothes him in a sense, or it distracts us from his nakedness. And in this piece, that kind of collapsing of the visual image, or that breaking down of the distance between us as observers and the subject who's in front of us, or who's presented, is happening maybe more on the level of the visceral, that and all through that bodily sympathy that you have when you see somebody's throat being dug into in that way. I mean, there's a certain physical response that you probably have, at least I certainly had, in which I'm not being touched, but I nonetheless feel I'm almost being touched. So that relation between how on the one hand there's a whole question around the voice and where the voice is located, and where the voice is located in the subject at any given moment, and how that might change, and at the same time a questioning of the image, which is somehow there's something kind of a bit iconoclastic, or trying to at least break the power of the image, which is so strong and which we're so completely habituated to being enthralled to somehow. And then on another level of the visual, being very aware that while Jacob was working, he had, of course, a whole internal visual process going on where and we talked about this, which is generally kind of quite diagrammatic, or it was...
Explain what diagrammatic is.
He was trained as a doctor, so when he's feeling through, what he's feeling with his fingers, he's also seeing in his mind's eye, and what he's seeing, he's probably seeing all sorts of things, and I couldn't begin to imagine many of them, and probably... he probably isn't even aware of many of them. But at the same time, what is certainly there is a kind of recalling of certain more schematic ways of describing what it is that he's feeling with his fingers in order to understand what he's doing, how he's moving those parts of the vocal tract around, muscles and
Actually,
cartilage.
just to make another connection to those who've been at the first day, ties back to how the stethoscope talk. Yeah.
And then, and I'm already having failed in my attempt only to speak about what we saw on the screen, but Alex was constantly being triggered with his own mental visions by that experience, because as Jacob said, any voice strain, even if it's from a professional singer who's clearly just overdone their voice, is always a psychological aspect, or it's always a psychosomatic aspect and a psychological aspect. So for Alex, while he was being treated, he would have these very strong, vivid mental images. And so one, for example, was he had the impression that his voice box was like a crystal sugar basket. They make these kind of spun baskets made out of strands of sugar, which are really brittle. And they make a kind of volume, which is suddenly at a certain moment, he saw this brittle nest of sugar strands being kind of cracked. This was a certain sensation in his mouth. And another time, he speaks about them on the video later, he talks about feeling that he's being led by the hand through a dark wood by Jacob, and he knows there are trees there, but he can't see the trees, so he doesn't dare move forward, but he has to move forward. So there are these different visual images which are not visual in the sense of retinal, but they are very strong images nonetheless, and they're kind of, although they can't be shown in the work that I made, they were referred to in the work that I made in voice, but it was more how my awareness of those images, those different orders of image, made me actually embrace the idea of being, the way that I frame certain moments, or the way that I change the colour of certain moments to evoke the kinds of projections that I was making upon what was happening. So these kind of roles that are very clearly designated of doctor and patient, I felt were actually moving through very ambiguous moments where there would be perhaps very kind of professional moments, but there'd also be very, very tender moments where you might almost imagine it's a father and son. There might also be very sexual moments, and all of this I felt was part of what was happening. And if this work was to describe adequately what was happening, it would also have to somehow at least give a possibility to provoke those kinds of associations. This, by the way, is from a series of X-rays made of opera singers made in the 1930s, which I came across when I was doing some research at the Wellcome Institute in London. And apparently a single note was sung, and they also made one single LP record disc with that single note, accompanying the making of the X-ray. But this, I really am intrigued, again, by this kind of confusion of languages between the medical and the musical notation. And also, it seems to suggest something about the fantasy or the possibility of being able to see the internal voice, to get inside the body and really see the production of the voice. But however far you go in, of course, it's not really going to get to any conclusive, it's not going to find the voice, because the voice has so many dimensions, which is one of the things that we've been circling around all day, in its physicality and its materiality and its linguistics and so on. And this piece is just a little moment, a piece I made when I was developing a work, and thinking about the relation between voice and body, and the way that Alex's body almost became like a medical dummy or a ventriloquist's dummy in its kind of inertness. This clip is Tony O'Donnell, who's a man I worked with in 2003 to make an installation where I was thinking about this idea of entry into language as an infant, which I was kind of rehearsing with my father in the piece Elocution, the first piece I showed very much as an adult. But that relation of sense of self and how language pins down and defines all sorts of concepts that we learn to use in order to understand the world. But what happens if we lose language? And how are those kinds of concepts still making sense? Are they still in place? And I was thinking, I was looking for a long time for somebody who I could understand as being on the threshold of language. On the one hand, I had my son, who was then 3.5 and was learning to speak for the first time. And then I learned that there is a condition called aphasia, which you can get from having a stroke or brain injury, which affects just the language cortex of the brain. And it's particularly interesting because so much other competence can remain intact, but just the language faculty, whether it's your reading or your writing, your hearing or your listening, can be affected. So all that we think of in terms of, what constitutes a person, what gives a person their sense of self and identity, their memory and their intelligence and their humour, and all of those things are still there. But the language various aspects can be wiped out. So Tony had had a stroke and he'd lost the ability to speak completely, and then he'd learned to speak very slowly using phonetics diagrams to help himself literally sort of place his tongue in the right part to make a T sound and so on. And then he'd had a lot of speech therapy. By the time I met him, he was very fluent, but he couldn't always find his words. So there was on a synaptical level, there was a break between thoughts and words and concepts and words. And although he has a huge vocabulary, and although his intellect is still all there, he very often can't find the right words to express what he wants to say. And then he knows exactly that he hasn't managed to find the right word, and he seeks another word. So when I first met him, I was asking him to repeat my words as a kind of experiment, and he was simply trying to say my face. And here he is trying to do this. My face.
Oh, my. Life. No, it's not. It's F first. Face. Hang on. Face. Life. No. Face. Assisting as I face.
So his face becomes this kind of other object. And also, what would normally be a synaptical connection almost seems to be externalized. He has to make the connection by sort of touching this and hoping it'll jog his memory and sort of make that connection back between the word and the thing.
It's like he's a ventriloquist with his face.
Speaking through objects.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Oh, 1, 2.
Okay, what do you want to start with?
I had fast food.
But look, it's I and hate.
I hate our fast food.
I.
I.
Hate.
8.
Hate.
Hate. 8.
Hate.
No.
Hate.
8. 8.
Hate.
I hate fast food. I hate. But I.
Do you want I hate?
Only paid. I hate.
I
hate. happened.
Did I say hate?
No.
What is H when you hear it? What is it? What do you hear?
Hate. I ate.
Hate. Water?
No.
Eight.
Eight.
Hate.
Eight.
Hate.
Eight.
What did you hear?
Hate. I hate. Eight.
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 Hate.
Eight.
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 Hate. I can't hear it.
Hate.
Hate. Eight. Hate. Can you feel it?
Is it? Hate. Hate. Hate.
Eight.
Hate. I hate. Hey, hate, hard, art, hard, art, hard, hard, no, art, hard. Heart, 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 land by heart.
So that was another man who has aphasia, but he has aphasia due to a cycling accident. And he has the effect of his aphasia is that he can't pronounce his words. He also can't really hear how he's pronouncing, so he can't really check his pronunciation either. But he doesn't have any problem, or he has less problem finding his words than Tony. This is a piece called I Hate, which is an installation that I made in 2007. And I thought, when I started researching for that work, that I wanted to look at the kind of power play and what is at stake in terms of what is lost and what is gained in that dialogue between the therapist and the patient. And I thought that I would be looking at how, in being drawn into some kind of normative, correct speech, the patient is also leaving their own language behind to some degree. But actually, in developing the work and in spending a lot of time sitting in different situations, in speech therapy situations, it became about something completely different. Oh, not completely different, but it shifted. So rather than that kind of violence that was inherent in dialogue, which is in the earliest work, and then maybe the restorative violence that you can see in Alex, here was much more about dialogue and about what is passed between the two figures. And one of the things that became very clear to me, or how I understood the situation over watching them concentrating together over many hours, was that the speech therapist, who happened to have been trained as an actress, so she's got a very, very sort of standard, perfect, clipped Queen's English, her language would start to morph and become closer and closer to Edward's language, because she started repeating more and more, and she'd break words down into smaller and smaller parts, and it became more and more nonsensical, more and more rhythmic, and about this subtle modification of the shape of a vowel, or the shape of a sound, or the shape of a word. And at the same time, Edward is kind of moving towards her, trying to refine his sounds to be as close as possible to her sounds. And that over time, they would start to produce a new kind of language between them that neither of them really speaks individually, but together they produce this kind of third language. And at some time, I was around that time thinking of in Mladen Dolar's book, The Voice and Nothing More. He has this Venn diagram where the two circles are overlapped and the space in the middle is the voice. And he talks about the voice being produced by both, but belonging to neither. Much more recently, I was reading about Paul Ricoeur, the French philosopher who wrote about translation, and he talked about linguistic hospitality. He talked about translation as being linguistic hospitality. And that, now looking back at that, or looking at what happens in a dialogue between two people who have completely different forms of language, or very different forms of language, even between different forms of national language. I think that idea of linguistic hospitality is very interesting, that you have to accommodate their language somehow, but you also have to leave your own language behind, and that can be quite uncomfortable. It can even seem quite dangerous.
Asher Silverman talks about this in a psychoanalytic term, and she calls it identification at a distance, where you leave your ego behind in a certain way. And that's really important in such cases where the person you are trying to identify with is so other than you that you really do have to leave yourself or some part of your ego behind in order to be able to do that. Because otherwise you just, the reaction is just to leave someone out and to repulse someone. Yeah. And that sense of leaving behind, but presumably, moving towards the other, means that you're not in a particular place in that period, in that time. I mean, you're in some kind of suspended relationship, some kind of ongoing, active suspension, but moving towards the other. And I mean, when I was first working with Tony, and he was trying to communicate with me, and leaving the safety of his own silence, I was constantly impressed by his sort of what it takes to start to speak when you don't know if you're going to arrive at the word you need to arrive at. And we touched on embarrassment earlier on, and you saw how Tony in that little clip was perfectly happy, even in front of a camera, to shut his eyes and just struggle to find that damn word in front of whoever he's speaking to. That willingness to leave behind more or less secure ground and kind of step out into some space. You don't know if you're going to actually hit ground again, or whether you're just going to fall through a hole, which is what he would often do. And then that whole way in which the kind of the to and fro of dialogue, which we're so dependent on and become so uncomfortable with when it doesn't happen. All of that became very much sort of what I was focusing on somehow, if you can talk about focusing on that. So when we come to working with with Edward and Judith in this piece, thinking very much about how can you make tangible something about what's happening in the space between those two people,
And it's partly through very simple means of looking at what's happening in the spaces between their two physical bodies. And then playing with, for example, playing with how very often, as you saw there, it's not quite clear, or it's offering up for your own kind of decision, really, whether the voice is coming from him or her. And there's a lot of putting her voice onto his body and the other way around.
I don't want to sidetrack too much, but I was just thinking, is that just something that happens when people fall ill or have something, or isn't that like how we use language all the time? Because my 10-year-old son claims that we cannot communicate because each is always speaking his or her own language, and that there is no common ground, even though, of course, he tells me this and he's expecting me to understand, but he says, at the same time, he says, you don't really understand what I'm saying. So maybe, then I argue, well, we always have to take a leap of faith, because you're right, we cannot reach each other. It's just that it's our desire that allows us to meet.
Well, he's very perceptive to be seeing how flawed the whole system is at the age of 10, I would say. Because, I mean, the people that you've been looking at in the last 3 videos all have quite extreme conditions of language, or quite extreme disturbances to how they use their voice or how they use their language. And what can be very interesting is how within those quite extreme conditions, that there are always, at least what I'm interested in doing with the work, is to find or respond to those grains of recognition that you can have within or in looking at somebody else's situation, which may be completely, on a different order to anything that you've experienced yourself. And in these cases, particularly, when language is not working, and some aspects of how it works and how we deal with it kind of become exposed in a way that can become very hard to grasp when it's flowing and it's functioning and it's kind of moving ahead, and we're all maintaining something which is held up on the one hand by actually a leap of faith, and on the other hand by habit and kind of mutual consensus and a kind of social contract, and all those things that make it just about work, and sometimes make it very, very powerful, of course, and very effective. And perhaps to say something about, this idea of the ventriloquial again, or the embodied voice, or the voice as it can be experienced, without a body, but then how it can be, particularly in these works where it becomes very much embedded in a physical body, and one's aware of producing voice as a very physical, biological process. In that speech therapy, when there's actually a physical exchange as well as a verbal exchange between the therapist and he's not really a patient. I mean, he's no longer medicalized. He's, I don't know, the subject or the collaborator in this process. What you were seeing was Judith helping him to recognize when he was managing to produce the right sound for I hate that sound. He couldn't hear it, so he had to feel it on his hand in order to know that he was kind of putting out the right amount of breath. And that physical exchange, for me, was very much like it's almost like a kind of a sculptural process. They're kind of passing this sound back and forth between them, and each time it goes to the other, it kind of comes back again, but invariably slightly different to the last time, and slightly different to the way the other one has pronounced it. So this kind of passing back and forth of a sound shape or a sonic sculpture or something. But in the piece, I was relating this to Edward's work, which he'd been a professional photographer, so he had an amazing. He was very skilled at describing mainly art installations and architecture with his camera. And when after he'd had his accident, he couldn't continue to be a professional photographer, but he was still taking a lot of photographs, and he'd become very interested in ruins, and he'd become very interested in building sites. And just near his house in London was the huge new building, the building site for the new Eurostar terminal in London. So he was going every week to the same few spots and taking a series of making panoramic photographs with a cheap little camera, putting them together, and following the changing topography of that cityscape around him. A lot of Victorian buildings are being knocked down and new buildings are being erected. So it was demolition and rebuilding. So these are some of his I used his photographs in my piece, and they were presented on 3 separate screens. in such a way that if a viewer would come along and pay attention to the photographs, then they would suddenly go in sync and you could see complete panoramas cycling up. And if there was no one paying attention, then they would come up at random, like a sort of fruit machine. And so this was showing a process of physical rebuilding on a very large sort of urban scale of architectural structures, which was echoing this rebuilding and breaking down of sound structures and linguistic structures in the speech on this kind of micro scale between the two individuals. So this is just some of the photographs that were coming up, and also with a composition of Edward's voice that was part of the installation. You can just hear, I worked with a kind of characteristic of his very repetitive, repeating sounds over and over again as he tries to get them right, but I also kind of composed it as in almost a musical sense. So.
I replace with replace. I will replace it again. And this job not in use. This one's not in use. It's one's not in use. And again. And build. 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 They build it up again. Build it up again. They build it up again. They build it up again. They clean and it up again and build it up again and twice the height.
So he was talking about his photographs, talking about details of what you could see on the image. But it got broken down into really quite a basic language about light and dark, whether it's there or not there. I'm not sure if there's something else to...
No, of course, we had thought about showing you 10 times as many works, and the recent practices has a lot of very, very interesting new developments. But I think we only have time for one last work, so I'm going to prompt you to.
But the last work that I wanted to show actually connects back quite closely in some ways to some of the earlier, ideas about the ventriloquial voice and the possibility of having several voices, but kind of transposed into a completely different cultural context, which is in Korea, South Korea, which is a culture and in a language that I'm completely ignorant of and very distant from. So I was invited to make a piece for Busan Biennale, and I wanted to work kind of productively with my ignorance and that sense of complete distance and all the possibility for misunderstanding that would inevitably involve. And I made a piece which involved working with two shamans, female shamans. I was interested in the shamans because in Korea they speak in voice, they work as like channelers or mediums, or I would say like a ventriloquist. They speak in the voices of different ancestor gods, and they change their voices to utter the words which had been transmitted to them from the gods when they do divinations for clients. So somebody will come along and ask them for advice, and they will either speak in their own voice, or they may be suddenly picking up on the voice of a god and actually speaking, offering their body in a sense for that god to speak through. And so on the one hand, they have multiple voices, literally, and on the other hand, they have a very interesting and complicated and kind of conflicting number of different positions within society. So on one hand, shamans are really denigrated, and now they're seen as being very old-fashioned, and they're not part of the sort of post-capitalist, globalized, highly technologized society. But on the other hand, people from every walk of life still go to see shamans and still ask their advice, from, like, you know, the head of Samsung to students and housewives. I mean, throughout, you know, across all the levels of society. And they're also treasured. I mean, they have this term, intangible national treasure, which is what it says. It's a living culture, an embodiment of Korean cultural tradition, and is hugely valued as such. But there can only ever be one at a time, one intangible national treasure, and when she dies, then another one can take their place. So it's a very, there's a very limited. So there are also, I mean, the traditional shamans are really tend to be very, well, completely uneducated. They also tend to be very alone and disassociated from society. They often leave their families. They can't easily live among people who are not shamans. They can't also live among shamans, because if they live among other shamans, then their respective gods get jealous and have fights, and so they're very much on their own. They also traditionally give up their names when they become shamans. So they lose their designation in a sense. So all of these aspects of this figure, which is very remote from my belief system or you know, background, nonetheless was striking many relationships with things that I have worked with, and that I do recognise from the ventriloquist. And I was thinking about John Burge's way of talking about women in general in traditional patriarchal society, which Korea is also a very patriarchal society, who have historically been, in a sense, condemned to occupy very constrained, but also very many different kinds of space and role at the same time, and how, in having to deal with that, he proposes, in ways of seeing, that women have had to learn to occupy several spaces at the same time. And his example to illustrate that is, he says that a woman, even walking across the room, grieving at the death of her father, will at the same time see herself walking across the room, grieving it. So even in the most extreme kind of internalized moment, you will still have this awareness of yourself from the outside, which I think has perhaps become an experience that everyone will recognize in a sort of mediatized society. But I was thinking about this also in relation to this idea that you can occupy different positions in different spaces. And so I worked with two shamans who you could say occupy completely different positions. One is a traditional shaman who has a very strong local accent coming from Busan, and has a very formulaic rhetoric when she worked with her clients. And actually I was sitting with her for several days, and I found that she was very often producing very similar kinds of speech. The same gods would come back, the same gods would say the same kind of thing to each client. And on the other hand, we have a shaman who has a completely different voice, which you could say is in this work. She's thinking whilst speaking. She's kind of forming, what she's actually doing is remembering. She had been through a traumatic experience 30 years ago when she had decided to become part of the movement, the pro-democracy movement, and joined students who were having protests against the military dictatorship. And she was prompted to do that by the death of one student he was tortured by the police and he died. And at that moment she decided that she's got to do more than just pray for people. She's got to actively take part in this protest and sort of lend her voice to it. There was a big memorial ceremony for this student at the Seoul National University, which is supposedly the best university in Korea, and still is. And at that memorial service, she danced a ritual dance, which shamans do to appease the souls of the dead. So if somebody's died in violent circumstances, then this dance will allow them to be restful spirits. But in trying to do this, she was too young, she wasn't experienced, she couldn't cope with the pressure. There were thousands and thousands of police, there was a very emotional family, and there were thousands and thousands of students. And she found that while she was supposed to make contact with this boy's spirit, she failed to do it. During that, for the next 3 years, she was involved in the street protests, but she became ill, and eventually she started to feel that she was losing a lot of weight, and one morning she woke up and she couldn't speak at all. She'd literally lost her actual voice. So she went to the hospital and she was told that she had a temporary aphasia due to exhaustion and trauma. But she decided that this was actually the gods giving her a warning that she should be concentrating on helping people and on going through the shamanic rituals and not being out on the street. So this is interesting kind of autobiographical, this narrative in which she kind of finds a political voice and then she loses her actual voice. And then through that, she decides that actually she's going to absolutely commit herself to becoming a shaman and to fulfilling the role of the shaman in the traditional sense. And that's what she's still doing. So for this work, I wanted to work putting these two women's voices side by side. And on the one hand, the very formulaic, sing-song, ritualistic voice of the shaman from Guimé, and on the other hand, the voice of somebody who is going back for the first time since she did that dance at university. I took her back to the university, something she was interested in doing, and asked her to retell the events that led to her losing her voice. So she was going back there and just being in that architecture, being in that physical place, which hasn't changed. It was built in the 60s, and it's all exactly the same, except the students are now very different. They're all very focused on getting the best qualifications they can get and then the best paid job they can get, whereas back then they were all protesting against, politically everything has changed. So she, in a sense, I was thinking of her voice as a voice, kind of, she herself was information in that moment, remembering as a creative act in which she kind of was putting herself together and kind of putting her own biography together. So I'll play you, just so that you can make a bit of sense, I'll just play you the two videos of those two shamans, and then one last clip before we finish. So the first clip is Sundok, if I can find her. I guess it's here. Yeah. I hope this is right. Yeah, let's go up.
너는 현재 너는 무엇을 지켜보고 있을까? 너를 통해서 나는 많은 거를 알았고 너를 통해서 세상이 어떻다는 걸 바라보게 되었어. 미안.
일단 조금 쉬었다 갈게요. 잠깐만.
나 너무 힘들어.
이번 대화에서는 그런 말도 안 되는 대화, 대화 같지 않은 대화, 말 같지 않은 말들만 오가는 것이 아니라 실질적인 대화, 정말로 대학생과 학생들이 합의점을 도출할 수 있는 대화를
성질을 보시냐, 그리고 거기에 대해서 얼마나 우리가 본부에 대한 신뢰를 가지고 있을 수 있겠느냐라는 질문과 의문, 그리고 회의가 터져나왔습니다. 어떻게 보면 그건 당연한 일이라고 생각합니다. 저는 2009년부터 학교에 있었고 2009년 학생 총투표를 통해 범인을 참가하는 학생들에게 모두 돌았음에도 불구하고 그 학생 총투표를 전면 부정한 논문의 태도. 그리고 2010년
네가 외쳤던 것은 무엇일까? 우리들한테 참 비가 이렇게 그날도 비가 왔는데 그 당시 나는 주변에 그 경찰들이 너무 많았고 그 분위기가 너무 지금하고는 대조적으로 살벌했고 그냥 억압받는 상태에서 진홍꽃에 들어갔기 때문에 또한 그 같이 진홍꽃을 하면서 도와줬던 풍물을 쳤던 친구들도 다 학생들이었기 때문에 민주운동을 하는 친구들이었고 글쎄 지금 이름을 밝혀도 될지는 모르겠지만 그때는 너무 어린 나이에 준비 없이 들어갔지만 굿을 해야 되고 춤을 추어야 되고 너무 아파가지고 몸부림치면서 내가 여기서 바닥에서 대굴대굴 굴른겨. 너무 많이 굴러가지고 몸으로 표현할 수가 없나. 내 한계에 부딪혀가지고 춤을 추다가 그냥 거의 탈진 상태에서 굴른 다음에 일어났는데 어떤 말을 문 열어서 혼을 실렸기 때문에 말을 해야 되는데 도저히 어떤 말을 할 수가 없었던 기억. 너무 아팠고 힘들었고 그래요.
뭐 목소리가 막 그렇다든지 이런 거는 모르고 그냥 애기 목소리 내면 아 누가 보는갑다. 뭐 애기 저 할머니 목소리 내면 아 할머니가 보는갑다. 이래가지고 신체적으로 막 이렇게 변화주고 이러는 건 없어. 그러니까 이게 과학적으로 증명이 안 되는 거라. 그러니까 이게 접신이라는 게 제일 중요한 기라. 그걸 접신이라기도 하고 귀접이라고도 하고 합신이라고도 하거든. 이제 거의 올 때 다 됐다. 몇 급 쳤습니까? 9급예? 언제 발표하는데? 4월 5일이네, 술날이네. 턱걸이는 하겠네요.
많이 좋아요. 그러니까 좋다. 이래 됐다. 할아버지 손께 잡고 왔어. 좋다. 이해했다야.
이름은 뭡니까? 저 나이는요? 다시 봐나. 임자생이네. 9월 27일. 시는요? 공두시 축시생이네.
어머니 네 사주에는 돈 억수로 많다. 이 사람이 갖다 주고 저 사람이 갖다 주고 나중에는 억수로 크게 부자 된다. 43살 되면은 억수로 부자 돼가지고 돈 여기도 조금 있고 여기도 조금 있고 이러는데 다 합쳐갖고 딱 나면 딱 좋다. 그러고 올해는 남자하고 붙어있지. 애인. 그 사람 참 좋다. 그런 아빠야가 엄마한테는 있어야 된다. 그 아빠야가 그렇지. 그렇지.
Voice. And perhaps just to say something about, I mean, on the one hand, there's a sense that there's the Sundok, the shaman who's talking about her past and is trying to remember or is constituting and telling her memories and was quite clearly moved by it and kind of somehow bringing those memories back to the present. There's a sense of an authentic voice, or that she's speaking for herself. And the other shaman, the Guime shaman, who has no name, is speaking with these kind of really caricature voices. To me, she sounds like a kind of Punch and Judy, you know, puppet voice. But, you know, when I was making the piece, I was thinking about how one can have a sense of being oneself in speaking somebody else's, in speaking in somebody else's voice, and speaking in somebody else's words. And thinking back to once making a piece with two professional impersonators. One of them was an impersonator of Sandy Shaw, the singer Sandy Shaw, who said that when she began singing Sandy, she really found her voice. So these kind of what may seem very didactic kind of oppositions that are set up, I think through these kinds of complexities that emerge over time, I think that those ideas of an authentic voice or a voice which may seem to be entirely artificial, but actually it still has its own singularity and its own, you know, it works for her. That's somehow these are the kind of confusions that I wanted to work with and set together. Well, there are other elements that I would have liked to show, but there's I think maybe much better now just to see if there are any responses or comments or
we have maybe I'm willing to extend for 5 more minutes. I think that's okay, but it's 7 o'clock, so we can invite some comments. Just I'd like to say that the whole aspect of technology, which is now dealing with visualization of voices and also controlling, it's also state controlling through voice and through surveillance and all these aspects of your work we haven't even started to touch upon. So if people want to go and see something, what's the next place where they can see something contemporary that you're doing?
Several, I mean, I think the next piece that will be fairly visible is in Sao Paulo, the Biennale, but then I'm making a live performance next week for the first time, which is going to be a really interesting experience, responding to an invitation to make a live performance, working with everyday conversation, but stage. That will be in Liverpool and in Loughborough. And then,
so Imogen will leave those details with Gabriëlle, so that if you're interested in following this up, please do. Because also it's always more interesting to see a real work rather than just a representation.
Yeah, we're just looking at sort of a little slice which kind of can work in this context, a slice of image and sound, really.
Are there immediate responses you want to?
Is this on? Yeah. I find your work absolutely fascinating, and I'm intrigued by a couple of things. One is the psychological aspect when I think about the various voices that you dealt with, the get over here thing. Now, were they found recordings, or did you set them up? Did you hire people who had different kinds of accents? And I mean, it seems quite obvious that you're dealing with aspects of psychology, you're dealing with aspects of danger, of physicality and discomfort, and all of those levels are fascinating. So whatever you want to respond to is fine.
Did you say about Get Here, the sound piece?
Yeah, the Get Over Here. I was curious about those particular voices, whether you had found those samples.
It was both, yeah. I mean, I worked through... I was always making work with people that you don't yet know. You have to kind of find steps towards them. So I worked through people who knew people who knew people. Finding the local people was easy because I have a son who's at school, and then there's immediately a huge network of parents and so on. But I wanted to work with people who had been only recently in Liverpool, and I knew that Get Here is like a kind of vocal key that people, even if they don't say much else, even if they haven't learned even much English, they tend to be able, that's one of the first phrases they can say fairly convincingly. So I went and just made contact with people in the so-called Somali community, which is next to the next neighbourhood where I live. It's very concentrated. There's a huge concentration of Somali immigrants who've come within the last sort of 10 years. And then you know, this thing of the relation between having all that is attached to the idea of having a voice, and also how people sort of protect their sense of self through their accent, and at the same time can be very embarrassed by it and want to distance themselves, all these kind of conflicting values that people hold for their own voice. I wanted to have this combination of people who would identify with that voice and feel that it's part of what shapes them and part of what they can identify with but then people who feel, you know, very remote. So talking to people who have not been in Britain very long seems like just, yeah. But there is, it can take a lot of time, and it can be a very interesting process to see how you can arrive at the person you want to speak to, and it can be very indirect and very slow. I mean, working with Tony O'Donnell, the person who I just showed you a little research clip from, took me more than a year to be able to find somebody who I could work with. Who, first of all, because of you know, confidentiality concerns with the national health system, and then because most people who I met who'd had a stroke and had aphasia were so, their sense of self was so completely undermined that it would have been very difficult to make a work that wasn't about tragedy or wasn't about their struggle to deal with their condition. Whereas with Tony, he was one person I found who was so interested in his condition that he was really kind of engaged and reflecting himself and kind of working with it and very humorous with it. And so, yeah, it's the finding of the way to approach and to get contact with the subject is a lot of the work, really.
One last comment.
Thank you. I have a comment and a question. Do I have time for both of them, or shall I choose? Okay. It was really interesting for me to see those two works, one about Get Here and really like local work about Liverpool and the accent there, and also seeing your work about Korea, which is really far from you culturally, and the way that the both of works were about voice but still totally different. And I also really enjoyed to see that when you're far from some culture, how you can approach as an artist. I mean, how you can find some opportunity to become closer, especially through history and political situation. But I had a question about this work in Korea. Was it an installation, and we could compare two voices of this these two shaman, or they were separated work? I didn't understand.
It was an installation. In fact, they were projected onto either side of the same single screen that was in the middle of the space, and then there were other objects, other elements. There was a 3D laser scan of an object, of a ritual object, of a straw doll, which is, in a sense, an object which has a voice within shamanic belief. So there was a physical object, there was an artifact, there was this straw doll which is used to kind of exorcise disease in somebody who's ill. And then there was a representation of that through a very highly technological means, through 3D laser scanning. And I mean, especially in Korea, where traditional beliefs and very different forms of belief system completely intermingle with rationalized, kind of westernized forms of thinking and economy. I mean, they are not relegated. They're not relegated to some kind of other space that's called religion or something, and there's a complete confusion. So it made a lot of sense that there would be this highly rational, highly precise and efficient data mapping technology alongside another kind of image technology, which was shamanic mirrors, which are bronze dishes, which are meant to not reflect the visual, but they reflect the amount of energy that a shaman has. So I really enjoyed working with these, if you like, old technologies for making, for in a sense recording presence. But yeah, and so there was a lot of it was very much kind of within a.
I'm sorry, I'm myself very much interested in continuing, but we can't. We have to just fade out. And Gabriëlle, are you coming up because you want to announce something, or are you just coming up to tell us that we have to stop? I'm not going to wrap this up because at this point I cannot wrap it up. I just have to fade out because there's so much to think about. So,
okay, then this is the moment to first and foremost thank Ruth for a really rich and wonderful day. I think it was indeed food for thought. I also want to thank Imogen, Louis, Natasha, Simon, May, who is not here, Lina, of course, by all means, and I'm now forgetting Dominique, and am I still? Simon. And Simon I already mentioned. And Junje, of course. Thank you so much. I think it was quite... And I think, yes, a warm applause for yourselves, the audience, to be here in such a focused way. It was really great.